one of the things I wanted to talk about from last week is this idea of reading sort of inside out and outside in, which is one of the things that I'm trying to do while we learn is for us to sort of explore the content. So right now we're learning about the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year and New Year's and stuff like that. And at the same time, we're trying to sort of pull apart these technical terms, these terms that are sort of signposts, punctuation. And yeah, I was just talking about you.
What I do.
We were concerned that you might be down to 612 mitzvot.
And so one of the things that I wanted to sort of name that Rabbi Goodman and I were talking about is this idea of reading inside out and outside in. And so what does that mean? So in some sense, reading the outside in is sort of reading it with all of the connotations. So I'll give an example. There's a word called ditanya. And ditanya, with all of its connotations, means it was taught in a baraita. A baraita is the same, a text from the same period of time as the Mishnah, early, the 2nd century or so. And so if you read that word and you try and translate it, it's not necessarily going to give you all those connotations. So outside in means you learn it sort of with all of its stuff around it, and then you put it in the text. The other way, inside out, is reading it in the translation. So ditanya comes from the word tane, which means it was taught. And if that was sort of all you learned, that's as far as you would get. Right? You wouldn't learn all of the rest of those connotations. And so you sort of have to pivot between the two. You have to sort of be inside out and outside in, back and forth. I'll give an example in English. If someone says the term the Middle Ages, you might think what? What would be your first assumption?
Being 50.
Being 50, right?
That's what I was thinking in your 40s.
Right? So the other connotation is, right, we're talking about the medieval period.
Being in your 1300s.
Right. So that sort of not being able to know necessarily what those words means is the value of reading it sort of outside in and inside out. Everybody with me on the idea?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Can I throw something in? Could
Yeah.
we possibly get a glossary of words that we could refer back to?
Sure. Yeah.
Are you volunteering, Dee?
So,
You're not allowed
so
to be volunteer
I
for
will
anything,
say the
remember?
following for the very gentle suggestion that I made around purchasing your own Gemara. I will say in between the end of the the section, the tractate, it actually has an index of all of the backgrounds, all of the languages, all of the personalities, stuff like that. That's not to replace a glossary, which I can try and come up with. So just a very gentle push for people to purchase their own. And if you don't want to, that's okay too.
I don't have room in my apartment. Living in an apartment, there's only so many things.
I bet the Aramaic to English and English to Aramaic dictionary is the #1 bestseller.
I'm a huge fan of it, but we'll come back. I'll try and find the right thing.
Okay, I just thought it would be nice because then when we would have that,
Yeah.
we're having our packets. So
You can if you want. Another time I can grab a blank sheet of paper if nothing else, and you can write it as we go, build your own along the way. But in the meanwhile, we're going to jump back into the Gemara. We were just talking about this idea of the Jubilee year starting in the month of Tishrei, which some of you will have, but just for friendly reminder, I will show you what it looks like. This is our holiday calendar, right? Mm-hmm. And so we are looking at Tishrei, which is right here, September, October, where Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and stuff like that is. That's the sort of new year that we're talking about. Okay, turn to page 284 in your packets, or share if you need to, because we only have one more paragraph before we are in the new packet.
284, 279.
284.
Apropos.
It should say apropos. Does everybody have that, or is there?
Okay, it's
I hope.
Oh, I put it at the front.
Got it. Everybody got it almost. Okay. Can I? So in line of what I was talking about, everyone look at the last line of the the last word of the second paragraph, it should say the word minalan and then a question mark. Does everybody see that? No?
Yes.
So 284, it's the one line in Aramaic. And the last word should be minalan. Mem, nun, lamed, nun. So if you want to put a box around that word means from where is it derived? So if that word, usually I think at the end of a sentence, but it could show up at the beginning, I'm sure. If you see that word, that means that they're asking a question of derivation. Where does one derive one of these things? Like, the question is, where do we derive this? So where could that possibly be?
In the Baraita.
It could be a Braita, another rabbinic text, but I actually don't think that's usually where it's from. Ultimately, they're looking for a biblical source. Now, they might use a Braita to get there, but they're looking for a biblical source for this, for whatever mitzvah they're talking about. Because the biblical source is going to be your best argument, at least to the rabbis.
And I think the sense is also that there's going to be some logical construction.
Possibly.
Right, that if it were simply that the verse said something clear, the discussion of how do we derive it wouldn't be so relevant.
Fair enough.
But if you've got, a biblical source on which they're going to base it, and then here's the logic by which they derive.
Great. So I want to make an important distinction. I think you're right, which is they're going to do a little bit of homework to get you there. But there are derivations that are only logical and not biblical. And so I want to make a distinction between the two. Okay, can I get a volunteer to read at least our question where it says apropos?
Apropos of the discussion of extending the Jubilee year, the Gemara asks, from where do we derive the principle that one extends a sanctified time period by adding from the profane to the sacred event?
Great. So we were talking about how the Jubilee year, you can't really extend time. It starts on Rosh Hashanah, but that there's this weird 10 days before Yom Kippur where it's sort of gray. And then we ask the question, all right, well, maybe if it's gray until Yom Kippur, it should be gray until Yom Kippur the following year, the 51st year. And the Gemara says no. It says year, means year, start to finish, period. And so now this question is saying, okay, well, how do we even get this idea at all? Okay, so now look in the Aramaic, in the new paragraph, it says Ditanya, which I've just said, is it was taught in a Baraita, that's the very first word. Does everybody see that? And then I want to point the important word, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth line, first word down, and it's the word Ela. Does everybody see that?
Ella.
That word means rather, meaning to say, or but. Meaning to say, it could be this, rather, we learn this, right? I don't know exactly what the context is yet because we haven't read it inside, so I don't want to give anything away. But we already know it's going to have a teaching and then some sort of a splitting, a distinction of some kind. Okay, can I get a volunteer to read as it was taught in a Baraita?
As it is,
Go ahead.
as it is taught in a Baraita, the verse states, in plowing and in harvest you shall rest. Rabbi Akiva says, it is unnecessary to state this about plowing and harvesting during the sabbatical year, as it is already stated. But in the 7th year shall be a Shabbat of solemn rest for the land, a Shabbat for the Lord. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard.
All right, let's pause. Before we get to the rather, can you translate from English to English for me here? What does this mean?
So there's a duplication, right? There's two verses that seem to be saying the same thing, that you're not plowing or harvesting the land.
Which is a problem.
Well, it always is, right?
And let's just name it. Why is this a problem?
Because one's got to be extraneous. The Torah, if it was given by God, God would never repeat God's self willy-nilly because that's not how God rolls. So each one has to have independent, specific meaning.
So in the rabbinic conception, no words are extra, which means if something is said twice, it means it has to have a separate meaning. And here, in the book of Exodus, it says, in plowing and in harvest you shall rest, which would make sense that we're talking about the sabbatical year of some kind. But later on, it says more specifically, in the 7th year shall be a Shabbat of solemn rest for the land, a Shabbat for the Lord. You shall neither sow nor prune your vineyard. What's missing?
Harvesting.
Harvesting, right? It doesn't say harvest. Right, so it means either we need another verse, or we need to find a way to make something mean something else.
Right. But I think in terms of the sort of logical structure, right? So the Baraita says, here's the verse from Exodus. Rabbi Akiva is now pointing out, well, wait a minute. This is duplicated. Ella, rather, here's the meaning. Where it's not just the plain meaning.
Right. We haven't gotten to the
Right.
resolution yet.
But just in terms of the logical structure, we know what's coming, which is the explanation of this apparent duplication.
Right. And I would remind, Paul.
It's not really a duplication completely, though, if his harvested is not listed.
You're right. It's not a perfect match.
Yeah.
Right? Which gives Rabbi Akiva probably some wiggle
Loophole.
room. Yeah, exactly right.
Wiggle room.
Let's not forget that the question we're answering is, where do we derive the principle that one extends sanctified time period by adding to the profane to the sacred at both ends? Right. So the example of that, which Rich gave last week, which was you could light Shabbat candles early, and you could do Havdalah late, and Shabbat is all of that time.
Well, and actually, the rabbis build that in anyhow,
Right.
Because you have to light candles 18 minutes before it's sundown, right? And you don't do Havdalah at sundown. You do it when you see 3 stars. So the rabbis have built in
Exactly.
that extra time, which is dependent on this principle.
Right. Exactly.
It would be interesting to at some point to go over how that extra time got built in and changed or extended over the millennia.
Right. Well, so here's the question of where does this start in some sense, right? This is the starting point of that principle, right? It'd be interesting to trace this idea through the halachic texts and the midrashic texts and things like that. Be a cool research project. All right, Rabbi Stein.
Rather, the verse, in plowing and in harvest you shall rest, is referring to the plowing in the year preceding the sabbatical year, going into the sabbatical year. That is, plowing in the 6th year that will benefit the crops growing in the sabbatical year. And about harvesting of the sabbatical year going into the year that follows the sabbatical year. That is, harvesting grain that grows in the sabbatical year in the 8th year. This teaches that there is a requirement to add extra time to the sanctity of the sabbatical year and not work the land both before and after.
Okay. How do people feel about that?
I've always known this. This is the source for an actual halakha that is applied in Israel, and it's always mind-blowing because it's so hard. Like, the shmita year is hard enough, but then to be told you can't plant the year before it and you can't harvest the year after it is crazy.
Well,
Is that what it says?
Yeah, that's what I think. That's what my understanding.
Well, I think what it's saying is a little bit more specific, that in the 6th year, you couldn't do a fall planting. So in other words, in the 6th year, you plant in the spring, you harvest in the fall, but you then can't do anything, planting for something that will then grow in the 7th.
So I want to be really, really clear. It doesn't say planting. It says plowing.
Right.
Well,
Right. So I just want to make a distinction.
Yes.
Right. Not that your
That is
conclusion
the point.
isn't right,
Plowing
which
is
is
unfair.
we're trying not to assist things that are growing in that rest year by plowing, right? But putting out seed, right? Sowing seeds might actually be planting might actually be its own.
How are you saying that hypothetically a smart farmer hits that field that last week of Elul in the 5th year, 11th month, and 3rd week because they can't do it the week after?
Right.
Right. Okay.
In other words, because the understanding is that this is not just literally the plowing, but it's any of the preparation or tending.
Right.
Right. So you wouldn't do any
Maybe.
preparation of the land.
Okay, so I make
It's still hard. My point still stands that it's supposed to be in my mind, derive according to the Torah, it's a 1 year, 365-day prohibition on planting and harvesting. But this law bumps those numbers out a bunch in a way that is even a greater hardship on a law that was already pretty difficult.
in my naivety, because I am naive, I thought it meant that before the shmita year starts, you should think about how best to rest that land or how best to prepare it for an early harvest in the beginning of the 8th year.
Which would be a rational thing to do.
Totally.
This is saying
No.
no,
But-
right? Which is attention. So actually, before we move forward, I want to read the notes at the bottom because I think they might add some additional context. So it says, plowing in the year preceding the sabbatical year, charish shel erev shvi'it. It is prohibited to perform any agricultural actions that encourage growth 30 days before the onset of the sabbatical year. The sages added a decree extending this prohibition for some actions to Shavuot and for others to Passover. The prohibition of agricultural work 30 days before Rosh Hashanah is categorized as a halacha transmitted to Moses from Sinai. And just so we're clear, when they say, where does this come from? And they say from Moses at Sinai, it means they have no idea. It is so old, they can't remember.
Well, this is absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
the
it
whole
is.
concept of the shmita year is to rest the land so the land recovers. We shouldn't destroy what God has provided. And so to not allow the land to be prepared for the rest, is crazy.
Right. Do remember, though, that but for both orchards and for fields, the hypothetical here, for those of you who are not big gardeners, when I went to rabbinical school, I learned all this agricultural stuff, and I was like, what is going on? I thought I was here for Talmud, but you had to know a lot of agricultural stuff that I did not know when I was 23 years old to go to rabbinical school. So one of the things that you learn when you garden is that if you are lazy and you don't get around to harvesting your stuff, it'll go to seed. And then the seeds will fall out, and they will, if you're lucky, plant themselves and grow, and then you can eat that next year on your land, on anyone else's land. So you probably aren't gonna starve, but also, yes, you're right.
Well,
this is a hardship and it's problematic.
Except,
But when you're plowing, you're loosening up the soil. So if those
Yeah,
seeds
yeah.
have fallen, you're
Yeah.
actually reseeding
Yeah.
them and setting them. I know from my own
Yeah.
gardening,
And
you
here's
flip the
the
soil
count,
over
right?
and it grows better.
You're not allowed to harvest during the 7th year. So in year 6, right, you've planted at Pesach. Rosh Hashanah comes along, that's the beginning of the 7th year. What do you do on Sukkot? Right?
Right, but you can glean, and you can glean
Well,
through other people's fields.
Make it
There's
define
actually
glean for us.
disagreement about that
Pick
question
up
as well.
stuff that's
lying around.
lying around.
Right.
There's
Has already
actually
fallen off.
disagreement about that.
Very good.
But then the problem, as I see it, right, is that, okay, stuff grows during the 7th year, right? And this is now suggesting that in the 8th year, right, you now hit Sukkot that 8th year, you're not allowed to harvest what grew during the Shemitah year. So that seems a little challenging
Yeah,
for me,
yeah.
just in terms of having, enough to eat.
Right. So
plowing, I mean, having in my later life, well, actually, I've kind of always been interested in growing food. But one of the ideas behind plowing is to take the remains, the organic matter, and plow it under, so it builds up the soil.
Yeah.
You need organic matter to provide nutrients. Things grow better when there's organic matter.
Yeah.
So I want us to read the rest of the notes because I think they'll be also helpful here. So I'm at the second to last line in English on the bottom. This is the case only while the temple stood.
Mm-hmm.
So we already now know the rabbis are a couple hundred years after this, right? 150 years after this. After the destruction of the temple, the sages canceled the rabbinic decrees extending their prohibition to earlier dates. They also discontinued the 30-day period and required that one refrain from agricultural work only a minimum time before the sabbatical year. So I think an important thing to point out is even though the temple does not stand, and I know that they're being very specific about which laws are being excluded, this sabbatical year process is ongoing in Israel. You know what year you've been there when the vegetables are not as good as they could have been. They do hold by sabbatical years. All right, let's go to the next paragraph.
But not the additional 30 days or anything.
That I don't know.
Great. No,
Right,
that's,
but that's what it suggests.
implies
Right.
strongly.
So now the harvesting paragraph. According to most authorities, it is prohibited to eat the produce that grew in the sabbatical year at all, even after the sabbatical year has passed. They do not distinguish between sivichin, produce that grew on its own, and produce that was cultivated in a prohibited manner. The Rambam, who is Rabbi Maimonides, who is a Spanish and Egyptian rabbi from the 13th century, the 1200s, the Rambam holds that there is no prohibition whatsoever against working the land during the 8th year. So we can already see a couple hundred years later that there's already some disagreement there.
That's the first I ever heard about not eating the food that kind of showed up during the 7th year.
Wow.
Or siffichin is very specific, which is produce that grew on its own.
Volunteer.
Right. So I don't know exactly how that applies yet.
I thought that was part of the deal, was that during the 7th year, food was supposed to magically appear a little bit. No.
So I think I don't know. That's a good question. So I think there's a really important piece here, which both of you are naming, and Rabbi Stein used it before, which is real human beings have their real consequences, which is if you cannot grow food, you may not have enough to eat. Mm-hmm. There are real human ramifications.
And the Torah, right, in the passage that describes the sabbatical year, is explicit that you eat what grows on its own.
Yeah.
Right.
This is like the first time I've ever heard of this. When Howie said it, I was looking at him like, Howie knows a bunch of stuff that I don't know. And it blows my mind.
And vice versa.
So clearly there's some fuzzy edges to this, right, where it's not entirely clear. And so our dilemma is how are we deriving this question about adding to this the profane and the sacred on either end of a thing, right? We're starting to see some of the ramifications of what that might, or a consequence.
Not only are the edges fuzzy, but it's not clear why they're fuzzy.
Yeah.
And I suspect that I'm never going to find out.
You mean the rabbis don't clarify their logic for why they each one has a different opinion about when the beginning and the end is?
So this section isn't over. Let's keep reading. So open your new packets, or it's not opening. Slide over. Switch.
If you went whole hog, like I had a class in rabbinical school where we only advanced 1.5 pages in a semester. Okay, so like you guys think we're moving slowly? Nah, this was slow. And that was because every time we got a question like this, he would say, okay, your tonight's homework is for you to look at these 4 sources in the back of the book and then these 3 excurses and to research this topic, which we will discuss tomorrow. Then you'd have to flip, if you whipped out, I don't know if we have what sets of Gemaras we have in here. There's some Gemaras that have there's the regular Talmud, and then in the back of the book there's another...
Those black ones there. On the right.
They have another 50 pages of excurses, including guys like the Rosh and the Rif and the Ron. And he would say, go through those guys, then go through the Shita Mekubetzet, then go through this guy, and then trace it back to the Kesef Mishnah, and then add to that the Ramban and Karo, and then we'll discuss on Monday. Have a good weekend, and then and then that would be the next week, is that we would go through, we'd crash through understanding every rabbi's
the next 800
opinion
years.
on the page to figure out what the actual answer was. And then when we were all done with that, we'd all be confused, the week would end, and we'd go on to the next line. That was in class.
So you're welcome for not doing
C-.
that.
C minus.
All right. With that uplifting note, you should be looking at page 285. We are on page 9a, so we've been learning for just over a year now, and we're now at 9a, which I think is amazing. We're at the top of the page should say the Baraita continues. Does everybody see that? Okay. I want to point out, I think one of the most important rabbinic constructions, which is, if you look at it, it's the 4th word. It says Rabbi Yishmael Omer, then the word ma. So if you write on your pages, write a box around that one, and then write another box around the first word of the next line, which is af.
Mine says met, actually.
It is.
So does this one.
This one says math.
Weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, these things were not normally pointed, so who knows?
Right.
Those two words, when they come together, mean something very specific. So even though the word ma or ma means what, that is not what this means. Ma'af is a construction that means just as and so too. So just as X is true, so too Y is true. Ma'af is that construction. And you'll notice that anyone who studies any bit of Gemara, which is all of you will find that construction, just as so too, will show up in your normal sentences in English.
Look at you.
We've seen this before.
I'm sure
Yes,
we have. But it's
I don't know
important to
what
point
page
out
you're
every
on.
single time, just as so too.
Just
Which
as
means
so too.
we know that Rabbi Yishmael is going to say, just as this is true, so too something else is true. Right? So we have our Baraita, in which we have a quote from the book of Exodus. Rabbi Akiva says, this is unnecessary. We've already seen it. Rather, this verse in Exodus means something else. And then the text continues with Rabbi Yishmael. Can I get a volunteer to read? The Baraita continues. Who hasn't read yet?
Oh,
Go for it, Rabbi Dan.
So, the Baraita continues. Rabbi Yishmael says in the verse, in plowing and in harvest you shall rest, is not referring to the prohibition against farming the land during the sabbatical year, as Rabbi Akiva explains. Rather, he interprets it according to the simple meaning of the verse, as referring to the prohibition against performing labor on Shabbat. The reason that the verse mentions these two particular forms of labor is to teach that.
Pause. So I just want to point out,
Just-
all of that is Rabbi Steinsaltz.
Yeah.
Right.
Right? Because only the bold on the text is the translation.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't make Rabbi Steinsaltz wrong. It's just important to know that that's his interpretation. He's giving us context so that we can better understand it, but we don't necessarily have to agree with him. Okay, go for it, Rabbi Dahi.
Just as the type of plowing that is prohibited during the sabbatical year is an otherwise voluntary act, as plowing is never required by the Torah, which is why you were making the distinction earlier that it has nothing, it's not about planting, it's about plowing specifically.
Planting's not required either.
That's right, but it's
Right
not
here we're talking about plowing.
That's right, we're
Go
talking about
on.
plowing. So too, the harvesting that is prohibited during that year is only voluntary harvesting. So this comes to exclude the harvesting of the omer from the prohibition, as it is a mitzvah. The barley for the omer must be harvested on the 16th of Nisan. Consequently, it is permitted to harvest the omer even during the sabbatical year.
Okay, let's hold off on the last line for a second because that's going to throw a giant wrench into everything. So let's pause for a sec. Let's make sure we're clear about what we're talking about when we say required and voluntary.
Uh,
Okay? Meaning to
well,
say,
we can at least attempt to.
we can attempt. For example, Joe, I know that you grow a lot of food in your backyard, right? You could
I
decide.
grow all of my garlic.
It's true. I've had the garlic. It is delicious. It is voluntary. You don't have to plow. You don't have to harvest it. You could decide on any given day, I'm just going to let it go. Right? You could. You may not want to,
But
which is fine.
there are times when I absolutely need the garlic.
No. Let's be clear about what we're talking about. You might need to for the sake of the food, but the Torah is not obligating you to. It's voluntary.
Yeah.
You're choosing to do that for the sake of the food, which is fine, right? You want the thing to grow and to be harvested at the right time, so you need to do it. But according to this perspective, according to the Torah, you don't have any obligation. You could just, right, not everybody's a farmer. The distinction that it's making at the end is there is a Torah-itic mitzvah to harvest the omer, barley.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Rabbi Yishmael is doing is making a very specific distinction here between things that are voluntary, like plowing and harvesting your land because you want food. It's not really voluntary if you want to eat the next day, but it's voluntary in the eyes of the Torah, and something that's required by the Torah.
Oh, because
Every
you could
year.
buy your food instead of growing it
Yeah.
yourself.
Yeah.
Well,
you could
and-
be a merchant.
And also, it's required every year.
the omer.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
We're
Torah
gonna
doesn't-
come back to that.
Yeah, but it doesn't give an option.
Right.
to
It doesn't
not
say
do it.
except for sabbatical.
That's
This
right.
is so quickly. This is one of the integral obligations or aspects of Talmud. So once upon a time, when I was beginning in my journey, I believed that all the mitzvot were equal, And as I went along, you learned that the Talmud on some level is the necessary enterprise of rabbis figuring out when one mitzvah supersedes another. There's many glosses of what the Talmud is, but if you were to take it on a simple level, and so this is one of those neat moments where you see that extremely explicitly and very carefully in like 4 words, like Omer supersedes shmita. Boom.
Right. Well, so I don't want to get that. Yeah, I want to make sure we're on the same page
So an
with
example
the
is
obligation
given-
and voluntary.
An
Yeah.
example is given about a Torah obligation. But suppose I'm walking from Babylon to Jerusalem, and I get robbed. All my food is gone, and I have no money. Am I prohibited from picking and eating?
This only applies in the land of Israel.
Let's suppose I've made it to Judea.
Right.
They're talking about the farmer that grew it. They're not talking about like somebody who's coming to collect.
So remember, based
Pay
on
out.
what we've learned here, we can't necessarily make those distinctions,
Yeah.
right? If you hire me to pick your fruit on a sabbatical year, we're all in trouble. I don't own the land, right?
Okay.
So I don't know the answer. Is the challenge, right? But what
My
do you,
assumption is the question between starving to death and eating forbidden produce has a pretty
right? So
straightforward
to your point before, right?
we don't
The
starve to
tradition
death.
is constantly rubbing two things that both are true next to each other, right? So the Gemara will often do that with two Mishnayot. Hey, we have this Mishnah and this Mishnah. They're not allowed to conflict. We also do that with values, right? People need to eat, and saving lives is really important, right? And also keeping Shabbat, right? So here, for example, pikuach nefesh, saving a life, will supersede Shabbat, right? The Gemara and the Mishnah give examples of where a building has fallen down and it's Shabbat. Should you go and try and see if there are people there, right? And the general answer is yes. It gets more
Okay.
complicated,
So
but
the general answer is it's a gray area.
yeah, I know you love gray areas when it comes to Talmud. So
Are there other areas in Talmud?
So the Talmud,
it's darker.
the Talmud seems to like to say yes and no, and there's no gray area in between. That's the example. It's example based, but
So-
perhaps that really wasn't the intent.
So I
to
wanna-
exclude the possibility of exceptions.
look, the rabbis love exceptions. So there's probably places where your circumstance, where someone is literally going to starve to death if they don't have any food, there's a way to navigate that. But let's be clear that this example, this dynamic, might be very specific to the circumstances. Meaning to say, we're talking about, right, so what Rabbi Yishmael is doing is saying, just as we apply this on Shabbat, we apply it for the Shemitah year. Right? In the sense that because we have choice in truth, we don't do it. And because we have choice here, we don't do it. The exception is the Omer. That's a very narrow circumstances of things that are voluntary that may not apply to your example, right? We want to see how far our analogies will go. I don't know. Your question is a good one. Yeah,
But
Paul.
wouldn't it be all right in Joe's circumstances if he picked something to eat that had grown itself?
So
Because the field had been left fallow and this regrows, and he's needy and he needs it and he's there, so.
So I want to make a distinction between what I think Jeremy Markiz and what I think the Gemara is trying to say. What I think Jeremy Markiz is, yeah, absolutely, not dying of starvation is
Exactly.
precedent. What the Gemara is not saying anything. We haven't encountered a circumstance where it sort of defines that. We can only base what we've learned together, right? And I don't know the answer of what the Gemara would say. The Gemara would probably have some tension.
I'm
over this.
comfortable not knowing the answer.
Good, yeah, good.
Didn't we just say if some of the fruit went to seed, or that you weren't permitted to eat it?
It did say that at the bottom of the note.
So therefore, it'd be the same thing here as walking along and
Plucking it off.
eating it, pulling off some fruit.
Right. I'm going to throw another wrinkle, and then I want us to move on, which is, what if you didn't know it was a Shemitah year, and so you did it by accident,
You're
as opposed to on
responsible
purpose?
Well, that's like
No, but there's a
original
distinction
sin.
between when you know something and when you don't know something.
Or you didn't know that you had stepped over the boundary into the land of Israel. Or you didn't know whether the owner of the land was Jewish or not. All of those.
Right, so I throw those as wrenches to say that things are not so simple, but your point is well made. Right, your point is well made, which is this the circumstance we're talking about might actually be excluded from that note. Right? All right, let's move on. I don't want to spend... the last thing I want to say is the Omer. So the Omer is the barley harvest, which is specifically named as a mitzvah. As you said, it doesn't make a distinction except for sabbatical years. It's every year.
Can I ask a dumb question off of this?
Yeah, 1 second. It meaning to say that here, according to what the Baraita says, is that the Omer year might actually be something where you can harvest on the sabbatical year.
The Omer meaning here, you harvest it and this is the Omer offering that you bring to the temple, or this is all the barley that you harvest from that year, meaning like barley is an exception to all Shemitah rules. You can eat as much of it as you want while tithing the rest.
It's a great question.
I would think it's a farmer, but I would like it.
So here it says this. Here it says this in the note. If you look on the right side of the page, right where the picture is, it says, I'm about 5 or 6 lines down, where it says newly ripened barley. Yours does not have a picture. Newly ripened barley was harvested on the night before the first day of Passover and prepared as roasted flour. So it might be distinctly talking about newly grown, newly ripened barley as opposed to other types of barley. So I don't know.
Well, no, I think it's saying that this is referring to the offering that was brought to the temple. So it's not that you harvest the barley and you can then eat barley. It's the barley you bring to the temple.
How did you get the barley? If you weren't allowed to plant it, how did you get it?
Well, one might argue that this would be an exception because in order to harvest it, you would have had to plant it, but it's not. But it's a specific exception because this is a mitzvah, and mandated harvesting, which might then imply planting, which, as you know, the text here says, is now mandated. Because it's mandated, it overrides the shmita year. As the halachic note on the top right says, it actually overrides Shabbat. That the Omer is harvested even on Shabbat because it's not a labor.
This is up at the top of the page.
The note at the top of the page.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so here's the question. I want to step back and then we're going to move forward, which is the following. Does Rabbi Yishmael's teaching here answer the question that we're trying to answer, which is, how do we derive that one extends sanctified time by adding from the profane to the sacred at both ends? Does Rabbi Yishmael's answer that question?
No, just add sacred time on top of sacred time.
Right?
Just squares it for the over.
Right. So his response so far doesn't answer our question.
Correct.
Right? Rabbi Akiva's did, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So let's move forward. The Gemara asks, can I get a volunteer who hasn't read yet?
The Gemara asks, if so, from where does Rabbi Yishmael derive this principle that one extends a sacred time period by adding from the profane to the sacred, both before and after?
All right, I'm going to pause you. Let's be clear. We had a question. Rabbi Akiva offered a verse. You might have learned it one way. No, it means this. Rabbi Yishmael has a totally different understanding of what that verse does. Right? So Rabbi Akiva uses the verse, in plowing and in harvest you shall rest, to understand the adding of time in the 6th and 8th years. Rabbi Yishmael says, no, that verse only means, right, that we apply the Shabbat and sabbatical years as similar. Mm-hmm. So we're still left with the question, which is, how does he answer answer our original question?
Which
Keep
is
going.
what the Gemara is just
Exactly.
doing right now.
Go for
The
it.
Gemara answers, he derives it from that which is taught in a Baraita. The verse states in reference to Yom Kippur, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th of the month in the evening.
All right, that's clear to everybody, right?
No.
I'm just kidding. Keep going.
One might have thought that one must begin to fast the entire day on the 9th of the month. Therefore, the verse states in the evening. But if it is so that Yom Kippur begins in the evening, one might have thought that one need only begin to fast from when it is dark after nightfall, when the 10th day of the moon begins. You want me to stop there?
Keep reading. We'll just read the paragraph and we'll go back to it.
Therefore the verse states, on the 9th. How so? How is this to be accomplished? One begins to fast on the 9th of the month while it is still day. This teaches that one extends a sacred time period by adding at the beginning from the profane to the sacred.
Okay, great. So right off the bat, what is Rabbi Yishmael's answer? Is it referring to the sabbatical year?
No.
No. He's using a different context to teach her things. So that's the first thing. What day is Yom Kippur?
10th.
It's the 10th of Tishrei. What time do Jewish days start?
Sundown.
At sundown. Right? Meaning to say that Yom Kippur, the 10th of Tishrei, starts at sundown, right? On the previous day, if you will. I'm trying to be careful about language here. Right? Okay, so let's go back through it. It says in the verse, in Leviticus, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th of the month in the evening.
But you have to finish eating before sundown.
That's true. But what day is Yom Kippur?
It starts
The
right
10th.
the 10th.
Right.
And it starts right at sundown, so you eat first, so you're not preparing or doing any form of work, and then it starts.
Absolutely.
Except that you have to light candles, and therefore start the day
Right.
18 minutes before sundown.
So
and
you've
you have
got to be
finish
done
80
eating
But so-
18 minutes
hence-
before
So
being
let's stay close to the text here. I don't want to get into candles yet for the time being. But you were right.
I want
That goes with it.
to talk about when the Chag starts, when sundown starts.
So how do we So how do we define? Let's be really clear.
This is something I've been confused about my entire life.
So around sundown, there are a couple of different iterations. What are they? There's when the sun is at the what's that called?
Horizon.
Thank you, horizon.
No, not the azimuth.
Azimuth, I think, is at the top.
This is the top. Not that.
At the horizon, below the horizon, right where it's still light, and then when it's dark. Those are the three options, right?
Well, yes, that's correct, but it's more complicated than that.
Is it?
Who decides when sundown starts and where are they located? Now, my presumption.
So you're talking about at the exact time.
Yeah, my presumption is that some priest at the temple.
So let's forget for the time being whether it's 9:52 or 9:55. Okay, I mean that's really late, I guess, for evening, but you catch me.
Not for this time of the year.
Right, that's true. Let's just focus on being able to see it for the time being. You look out your window. If the sun is at its horizon, that's considered sunset. When it goes below the horizon and it's still sort of light out, it has its own category. In English, we call it twilight. Mm-hmm. And then when there's no more light, we call that night. Okay? Those are the three categories. Mm-hmm. Here, I believe that they're talking about the first. The sun is at the horizon. That's sunset. Right? The morning has its own versions of all of these. So here, in the text, the verse says, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th of the month in the evening. Which might tell us what? When are we talking?
At or after sunset.
Right around sunset, where it switches
Between
from the
the 9th
9th and the 10th.
Yeah.
Exactly. So then, we talked about this, Olivia, we talked about this last week a little bit. If you look in the fourth line in the Aramaic, it says Yachol, right? That introduces a construction. In this case, Yachol is translated as you might have thought. And then we'll have a Kamash Malan in here, hopefully, to fix it. But in this case, you might have thought, right? You might have fasted the whole 9th, right? Why might someone think that?
Because you don't know which day the evening belongs
right. Could be the beginning of the 9th or the end of the 9th.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's not clear. Therefore, the verse states, in the evening. Because if it were so that Yom Kippur begins in the evening, one might have thought that one needed only to begin fast when it's dark. Meaning to say, if it said, you have to afflict yourself on Yom Kippur, you might say, oh, I'm going to wait until I know it's Yom Kippur. It's fully dark before I start fasting. And so he's understanding this to say, no. You got to give yourself some buffer time. The 9th in the evening. That's how he's understanding this text. Everybody with me so far?
Yes, but a buffer time from when?
I think my understanding is that it's unclear until this moment, and the buffer time is right before the beginning of the 10th, the 9th in the evening.
Right.
Yes,
But you're talking about physically. I mean,
So-
not from what you see.
Yeah, so
the temple is on top of a hill. So sundown is going to occur sooner. At that point, let's say when they light the bonfires to let everybody know it's sundown, or I guess,
or however
so-
which way they do it.
or, yeah. So, but if I'm down in the valley, sundown is going to occur sooner.
Can I try to answer? Go ahead. You go.
So the topography of the Temple Mount is more complicated than that. Because if you're facing east or south, it drops off from there, right? However, if you're facing west, in particular north, it's actually
Rising.
in a bowl, right? So here's the Temple Mount, and to the west, it's actually higher. It goes down and then back up. So if you're on the Temple
And
Mount to
there's-
observe sundown,
There's a wall there too.
well, it's not the wall.
Can I answer?
It's actually the land.
Yes, but
So
but there's
if you're
a
on,
wall. There's
Yes.
a wall around the temple.
Yeah. The
well,
Talmud
no, but you're
deals
you're
with-
above the wall.
The Talmud deals with this in Brachot. It deals with the whole question of when Erev starts. It's like the whole first section of the first tractate of the Talmud.
When the priests come get their truma, right?
It's past there, but yeah. But basically, they don't care where you are in the land. It's not that the temple declares it for all the people west, east, north, and south. It's where you are at that moment. And it also doesn't have, so the weirdest thing in my brain, one of the things that I always get mildly irritated about is the fact that there are websites that give you a longitudinal and latitudinal exact time for the lighting of Shabbat candles. Because the Talmud in Brachot basically says don't do that. And it gives a variety of possibilities as to when Shabbat starts. And it has to do with where the disk of the sun is in proportion to, and there are multiple opinions.
It's
So
at our
there's some gray
location.
area, of course. Yeah, and it's where you're at. It's not where the temple is. The temple doesn't matter.
I
It only
also
matters to the guy who's standing on top.
I also want to be
Sounds
clear
good, too.
that the rabbis are living in a post-temple period, like us. Meaning to say, it doesn't matter when the temple is because wasn't standing. It wasn't one, right? So I want to make sure because I want us to make sure we understand this sort of breakdown here. The verse says you start to afflict your souls on the 9th in the evening. We know explicitly that Yom Kippur is the 10th. We might have thought we actually fast all of the 9th also. But Rabbi Yishmael is telling us, no, it says in the evening, and therefore it starts right before Yom Kippur begins. What has he sort of proven? Or what is he... Oh, here's the last line. How do we accomplish this? How do we accomplish this fasting on the 9th in the evening? He says, one begins to fast on the 9th of the month while it is still day. Meaning to say, before evening, right? Before the sun actually sets. When it's daytime still. Right?
So you're extending again.
And therefore, say it out loud, Paula.
We're extending again. There's our loophole.
There it is. Which is, we've now extended the sacred time, Yom
We could
Kippur,
all go sit up on the roof
early,
and watch the sun.
and
go
therefore
down.
he has made his point. Right? Which is, how do we derive this? He's deriving it from the context of Yom Kippur. Is everybody with me?
But he's only proven adding time before
Correct.
the sacred occasion.
Correct. Right?
We're going to get it on the other end when we
Right.
break too, probably.
Right. So he's done half of the job. He's done half of the job. So let's just review for a moment, and then we're going to end. We started the question, how do we derive this adding of sacred time to
On
profane?
both ends.
On both ends. We got one answer. What was Rabbi Akiva's answer? Does anyone remember? It was like so long ago. Anyone remember?
Because of the plowing for the sabbatical year.
Right.
It's just as so.
Right? He makes the distinction. He says, you might have thought that plowing and harvesting are both prohibited, but we already have a verse that tells us that. And so what it comes to teach us is that you are not allowed to plow before and you're not allowed to harvest after. Right? So he splits the verse in half. And he says, we already have something that proves our point, which is that we're not allowed to do these things. And so this verse, which seems extraneous, isn't. We're splitting it, we're putting it on either side. Excuse me. Rabbi Yishmael comes and says, not so much. That doesn't really work for me. Because your verse comes to teach that just as we do this on Shabbat, so too we do it on the sabbatical year. Right? So he's using the same verse to have a different conclusion. Which means what?
They can't both be right.
Or, yes, sort of. Right? So remember, the rabbis can do two things. One is they might use verses for different conclusions, right? And they might get the same conclusion from two different verses. Right? It goes in both directions. And we're seeing them both here. Right? Which is we have one verse that has two different conclusions. That's the one we just talked about. And so then we have a problem, which is we now have a hanging conclusion. Is everybody with me? And therefore, we ask the question, well, how does Rabbi Yishmael get to the conclusion? And we've started that conversation. Yom Kippur is our premise for the first half of our conclusion. Is everybody with me? So I think one of the takeaways for us, sort of before we end, and we sort of, all right, we've lived in shmita land for the last hour or so, and I want us to walk away for the rest of this week with what to think about. I think for us, to me, what calls out to me is this idea around voluntary and obligated concepts, right? Thank you, obligatory. It didn't spend that much time on it, but I actually think that's a really fascinating construction for us to think about, which is what requirements are really on us, where are those requirements coming from, what things do we do as voluntary, and it may not feel voluntary, but it is voluntary, right? Paying taxes is not voluntary, right? But deciding which way I get to work might be voluntary. All right, those are really extreme examples, but so I think there's an interesting question for us to think about, which is how does obligatory voluntary affect us, and what do we, what consequences come from putting those things in either categories? So that's one of my takeaways. Do other people have a takeaway they want to from this learning today? They want to name?
Well,
Yeah.
to me, yes. I mean, to your point, but also that those things can be debated as to which falls in which category, and that there's an element of nuance and also possibly flexibility in the way people decide what they're going to do. So that just because, in other words, what I'm saying is it's not set in stone which is which. That there's a lot of slide between those categories, which can lead to a lot of different actions on the part of different people.
Different responsibilities.
Yep.
How about that?
So I'm actually comfortable with this concept of the gray area. Very comfortable. I had, growing up in an Orthodox environment, my family was never Orthodox, by the way, but growing up in an Orthodox environment, this concept of you can never, it always bothered me. So yeah, there are things that you do all the time, and things that you really don't do. But life is gray. It's gray, and what's acceptable today may not really work tomorrow. And David and I were talking about this on the way up. The Orthodox tradition of you can never do this, it really doesn't help me as I go through life. It bothers me. No. And let me just say that there is no Orthodox tradition. It's a bunch of traditions, and every Orthodox Jew has their own interpretation.
That would be true around all the movements then,
everything.
probably.
It's everything.
Yeah.
That's life in general.
It depends which
Everybody
rabbi you
interprets.
ask what interpretation you get.
Anyway, to your point.
I'll just stop there.
Great, thank you.
I was just thinking about the gray areas in today's life. You're going to take classes and you wait 10 minutes to see if the teaching assistant shows up and 15 minutes for the professor and whatever. How long do you wait? It's, gray areas. And it's still applicable.
Great.
There's a lot of other how long do you want to wait for the bus before you call Uber?
But talk definitely about sacred time right there.
But it's gray areas. It's flex time. It's that gray loophole for everything. We're always waiting for something.
You're rushing to wait.
Hurry up and wait. It's exactly it.
Cool. So, unless anyone else has something else they want to just share, good learning today.
It's neat.
I think this is sort of, we haven't finished the thought. There's more to uncover. So, to say the least, we don't get a new section until the next page. So, we've more to discuss. We'll meet back again next week. Have a wonderful 4th of July. I want to name a couple of interesting programs that I think people would like. First is we have, starting on Wednesday from 11 to 1, Reverend Canon, I was going to call her Rabbi, Reverend Canon Natalie Hall of the Episcopal Diocese, and I will be teaching together a series on life cycles. So we'll talk this week, for example, is about sort of birth and initiation rites. So we'll talk about baptism, and we'll talk about Brit Milah, circumcision and baby namings and stuff like that. So we invite you to come, free lunch, free babysitting, and we're going to probably live stream the teaching portion of it. Part of this is about building community, but we're going to live stream the teaching portion of it. So if you look in the bulletin, there's the link to the Zoom. We'll also stream it online on Facebook Live, so we'll have both. And that's the first thing. The second thing is starting this weekend, we have Noam Sienna, who is a scholar, and Noam wrote a book called A Rainbow Thread, which is about queer and LGBTQ texts from the last 1800 years, Jewish texts. It's, I think, from the 1st century to 1969 is the subtitle of the book. Noam is going to be teaching after Kiddush, right before Mincha, in the afternoon, and then also on Sunday morning, which I think we'll also try and live stream. Should be great. The book is great. It's an anthology of these texts. I mean, it's a fat book, and I would highly encourage you to come to both of those. The last thing I was going to say is there are a number of online classes starting. Not really classes, sort of like study groups. 2 of them around the Parsha. One of them is sort of broad, big ideas, and the other one is very textual. So if you're interested in one of those, they are on at 8:30 at night. One's on Sunday and one is on Tuesday over the internet. So it's over Zoom. It's not in person. So you do not have to come to this building at 8:30 at night. So if you are interested in either of those, please let me know. I think those are the big announcements I wanted to name. Any other things people want to mention? Yeah, Joe.
The holy.
Right.
And it's holy with a W followed by holy with an H. So there's lunch, but I haven't seen an RSVP request.
There is a link for an RSVP, but we expect people to arrive anyway. So we'll just hopefully get enough food. We'll see what happens. Okay. We have gotten a bunch of RSVPs by email, both in the Christian community as well as here. The goal of that program is for certainly to learn together, but the goal for Canon Hall and I is really, do people hang out afterwards? Not just in the session, but after the end of the 7 weeks. Are people spending time with people in a different community? Because that's really the goal. It's good to learn together, but
are you going to have anything as a chavruta format?
There will be opportunities to have conversations on one-to-one.
Because one of the things I experienced quite a bit, I don't know if you did in rabbinical school, because I took courses, Islam for Jews and Christianity for Jews, is that we were matched up, a Jewish person and a Christian person, to learn together with the same.
So this is much more fluid than that.
Right, but I'm saying if there are opportunities within the format.
There's certainly opportunities to have one-on-one conversations, and people can certainly learn after.
Interesting.
Yeah. Awesome. Good learning today, everybody.